My name is Denise Carter. I'm 27 years old, and the moment everything finally collapsed happened in a quiet mediation room where my father leaned back in his chair and told me I had been unjustly enriched. He said it calmly, like it was a fact everyone else in the room already understood. According to him, the fair solution was simple. I owned a townhouse now. My sister had nothing, so I needed to fix that. I needed to give her half. That was the entire argument. Years of work on my end reduced to a sentence he repeated twice, slow and deliberate, as if the repetition alone could make it legally binding. Give your sister half. The mediator watched us carefully. My mother sat with her hands folded like this was already decided. My sister looked relieved, almost vindicated, like the room had finally corrected a mistake that should never have happened in the first place. No one there expected me to refuse. No one expected me to open my laptop. But I did. I placed it on the table, turned the screen so everyone could see it, and pulled up a financial account none of them realized I knew existed. A single spreadsheet filled the screen. Transfers, dates, balances, a pattern that had taken me weeks to piece together. $360,000. That was the number sitting at the bottom. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The silence in that room felt heavier than the accusation that started everything. Because the moment that number appeared, the conversation about my townhouse stopped being the real story. Before I tell you what he said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now? And where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. A few months earlier, my life was still quiet. I had been living in a cramped one-bedroom rental on the north side of Pittsburgh, the kind of place where the radiators clanged all winter and the windows rattled whenever a truck rolled down the street. It wasn't glamorous, but it was cheap, and cheap had been the entire strategy of my 20s. Every dollar I earned had a purpose. I worked as a compliance analyst for a regional logistics company downtown. The job wasn't exciting, but it was stable, and stability was something I had been chasing since I was a teenager. I had started working early, long before most of my friends thought about rent or student loans, weekends at restaurants, tutoring sessions during college, internships that paid almost nothing but open doors. That routine never really stopped after graduation. It just became longer hours and bigger spreadsheets. Saving money had become second nature. I tracked everything: groceries, utilities, the occasional coffee I allowed myself on Fridays. Over time, those small decisions started stacking up. What began as a thin emergency fund slowly turned into something else, something that finally made a different future possible. That was how the townhouse happened. It sat halfway up a steep street in one of Pittsburgh's hillside neighborhoods, a narrow brick row home with tall windows facing the valley below. The place wasn't large, and it certainly wasn't luxurious, but it had 2 floors, a small back patio, and something I had never had before: ownership. The first evening I walked through it after closing, the rooms were completely empty. My footsteps echoed off bare walls and unfinished wood floors. I remember standing in the living room for a long time, trying to process the idea that the place actually belonged to me. It felt unreal. I hadn't even told my family until later that night. I sent a short message in our group chat. Something simple, nothing dramatic. Just a quick note that I had bought a townhouse and would be moving soon. I expected a few congratulations, maybe some surprise. The response was not what I expected. At first there was silence. Then my mother called. Margaret Carter had always had a way of sounding calm while still making every sentence feel like a correction. Her voice carried that same tone during the call. She asked a few practical questions about the house, but underneath them I could hear something else building, something sharper. Eventually the conversation shifted to my sister. Felicia had been struggling for a while. Her photography business never really stabilized after college, and she had spent the last couple of years moving between short-term jobs and creative projects that rarely paid enough to support themselves. My parents had stepped in many times to help her stay afloat. That history slowly became the center of the conversation. My mother started explaining how difficult things had been for Felicia lately, how fragile her situation felt, how discouraging it must be to watch someone else move forward while she was still trying to find direction. At first, it sounded like sympathy. Then the sympathy turned into something heavier. Responsibility. The idea appeared gradually, introduced like a practical suggestion instead of a demand. If I now owned property, maybe there was a way that ownership could benefit both daughters. My mother described it as balance, the kind of adjustment families make when circumstances are uneven. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed staring at the wall while she spoke. The implication slowly became clear. They believed my success had created a problem. Felicia had no assets. I now had one. The difference between those two realities, in their view, was something that needed correcting. The call ended without a direct request, but the direction of the conversation stayed with me the rest of the night. Something about the tone felt unsettling, as if the townhouse had quietly changed my position inside the family without my realizing it. Over the next several days, that feeling only grew stronger. Small comments began appearing in phone calls and messages, questions about the size of the house, how many bedrooms it had, whether I planned to live there alone. Each conversation circled the same idea from a slightly different angle, as if everyone involved was slowly working toward the same conclusion. By the end of the week, the situation was no longer subtle. My father, Ronald Carter, finally called. He approached the subject in the same measured way he approached most financial discussions. Calm voice, careful wording, the tone of someone explaining a reasonable proposal rather than delivering pressure. Listening to him, it was clear that the earlier conversations had not been casual speculation. They had been preparation. According to him, the townhouse created an opportunity to help stabilize the family. Felicia needed security, something tangible that could anchor her while she figured out her future. My purchase had made that possible. All it required, in his words, was a small adjustment to the property documents, adding her name to the deed. He spoke as if the idea were practical, even generous, like redistributing something that had always belonged to the family rather than something I had spent years building alone. For a moment, I honestly thought he might be joking. Then I realized he wasn't. The situation changed quickly after that call. For a few days, I assumed the conversation would fade the way uncomfortable family discussions sometimes do. People say things in the moment, emotions settle, and everyone moves on. That was the pattern I expected. Instead, the pressure became more organized. My mother started bringing it up in nearly every conversation. She never framed it as a demand. The tone was always softer than that, but the message was consistent. Families share things. Families help each other when one person is struggling. According to her, the townhouse had created an imbalance that needed correcting. The more she repeated the idea, the more obvious the plan became. The property was no longer being treated as something I had purchased. It was slowly being redefined as a family resource. Felicia's reactions followed a different pattern. She didn't argue directly. Instead, she spoke about how difficult the last few years had been, how uncertain her career felt, how exhausting it was, watching other people move forward while she remained stuck. None of those statements mentioned the townhouse directly, yet the implication hung over every conversation. I listened for a while without responding. At first, I believed the situation would stabilize once everyone realized I wasn't going to change the ownership of the property. I assumed the request would eventually be recognized as unrealistic. That assumption didn't last long. One evening, my father asked me to come by the house so we could talk in person. The request sounded ordinary enough, but the moment I walked into the living room, I could tell the conversation had already been planned. Both of my parents were sitting at the table. Felicia was there too. Ronald Carter began the discussion the same way he handled most financial matters, leaning back slightly and speaking with the calm certainty of someone presenting a logical solution. He explained that he had been thinking carefully about the situation and believed the family had reached a reasonable conclusion. According to him, the townhouse represented stability. Felicia needed stability. Therefore, the most balanced outcome was shared ownership. The explanation came out like a series of simple steps, each one presented as common sense. The more he talked, the clearer it became that the decision had already been made somewhere else. The meeting was not about exploring options. It was about getting my agreement. I told him no. The word surprised even me because it came out faster than I expected. I had spent the previous days trying to imagine how to respond diplomatically, how to explain that the property was not something I could simply divide. But when the moment arrived, the explanation felt unnecessary. The answer was simply no. My father didn't react immediately. He just watched me for a few seconds, his expression tightening slightly as he processed the refusal. My mother looked disappointed. Felicia stared down at the table. Then Ronald spoke again. This time the tone had changed. He started explaining the concept of fairness in a much colder way, shifting away from emotional arguments toward language that sounded more technical. According to him, families sometimes function under informal expectations, agreements that develop over time, even when they are never written down. Those expectations, he suggested, could carry obligations. Listening to him describe it, the idea sounded strangely familiar, almost like something pulled from a legal document. I remember thinking how unusual it was to hear my own father describe family relationships using the same vocabulary that appears in financial disputes. The conversation ended soon after that. No one raised their voice. There were no dramatic accusations. The entire discussion unfolded with an unsettling level of calm, as if everyone understood that the disagreement had moved into a different phase. I drove home that night feeling uneasy but still convinced the situation would settle down eventually. It didn't. Several days later, a courier knocked on my apartment door and handed me a thick envelope addressed in formal type. The return address belonged to a law firm I had never heard of before. Inside was a demand letter. The document was written in dense legal language, but the message was unmistakable. My parents claimed that significant family resources had been invested in my upbringing and education, with the expectation that those benefits would eventually support the entire household. According to the letter, purchasing the townhouse without consulting the family had violated that understanding. They were requesting a correction. Specifically, the document demanded that I transfer half ownership of the property to my sister within 30 days. If I refused, the letter warned that legal action would follow. I read the entire document twice before setting it down. The realization that my own parents had hired a lawyer against me felt surreal at first, like something that belonged in someone else's story. But the more I looked at the pages in front of me, the clearer the situation became. They weren't asking anymore. They were preparing to force the issue. And that was the moment I stopped thinking about the townhouse as the center of the conflict and started thinking about something else entirely. That letter changed the way I looked at everything. Up to that point, I had still been thinking about the situation emotionally, the way most people do when conflict comes from inside their own family. I kept asking myself why they were pushing so hard, why something that belonged entirely to me had suddenly become a problem that needed fixing. But once lawyers were involved, the question stopped being emotional. It became analytical. My job in compliance meant I spent most of my days reviewing patterns in financial records, looking for inconsistencies that didn't make sense on the surface. The work trained you to look at numbers differently. Every transaction tells a story if you follow it long enough. That habit came back to me the night I finished reading the demand letter. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time with the envelope still open in front of me, thinking about the tone my father had used during our last conversation. The language in the letter felt strangely similar to the explanation he had given at the house. Certain phrases appeared almost identical, as if the argument had been rehearsed long before the lawyer ever wrote it down. The realization led me somewhere unexpected. My father had always managed certain financial matters inside the extended family. It was something he took pride in, the way some people enjoy being the person everyone trusts with important paperwork. Over the years, he had handled tax documents, insurance claims, and eventually the finances connected to one of our older relatives, Uncle David. Several years earlier, my uncle had sold the small steelworker's house he'd lived in for decades. The sale, combined with a settlement he received after a workplace injury, created a modest trust intended to cover medical care and living expenses as he got older. My father volunteered to help oversee it, explaining that professional financial management would make things easier for everyone involved. At the time, no one questioned the arrangement. Family members trusted him. For a brief period during college, I had even helped organize some of those records. My father once gave me several boxes of old statements and asked me to digitize them so everything could be stored electronically. The task mostly involved scanning documents and entering basic information into spreadsheets. Back then, I treated the project like routine clerical work. I didn't analyze anything, but the memory of those files resurfaced as I sat there looking at the demand letter. Something about the situation felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain yet. My father was suddenly willing to risk legal conflict over half of a modest townhouse, a property that represented a fraction of the assets he had handled for other people over the years. The intensity didn't match the prize. That imbalance was the first real warning sign. I opened my laptop and began searching through the external drive where I had stored those digitized records. It took a while to locate the right folder because the files had been buried under years of other documents. Eventually, I found them. A long sequence of bank statements and transaction summaries that hadn't been opened since the day I finished scanning them. At first, everything looked ordinary. Deposits from the house sale, transfers connected to medical insurance reimbursements, payments for routine expenses that made sense given my uncle's situation. The pattern remained consistent for a long time. Then, the numbers started shifting. Small transfers appeared that didn't match the earlier categories. They weren't large enough to attract immediate attention, but they were regular. Each one moved money out of the trust account into another account number that appeared repeatedly across multiple statements. I began listing the transfers in a spreadsheet. Dates, amounts, destination accounts. The pattern grew clearer with every line I added. Over time, the small withdrawals accumulated into something much larger. What initially looked like minor adjustments slowly built into a significant movement of money away from the trust. The total at the bottom of the column stopped me, $360,000. For several minutes, I just stared at the screen. The amount itself was shocking, but what unsettled me more was the timeline. Many of the transfers occurred during the same period when Felicia had been living in a downtown apartment my parents described as temporary support while she worked on building her photography career. At the time, I never questioned how that arrangement was being funded. Now the dates overlapped almost perfectly. I leaned back in my chair, trying to understand what the numbers were actually showing. There could have been legitimate explanations. Trust accounts sometimes move money between different investment vehicles or temporary holding accounts. But if that were the case, the transfers would eventually return. These didn't. Every line in the spreadsheet ended the same way, leaving the trust and never appearing again in the records connected to my uncle's care. That realization shifted the entire situation into a different category. The townhouse dispute was no longer the main issue. Something else was hiding behind it. Once the numbers were written out in front of me, the situation stopped feeling like a family disagreement and started looking like a financial problem that needed verification. My first instinct was to slow down. Numbers can create convincing patterns even when the explanation is innocent. Transfers might move between temporary accounts before returning to the original balance. Administrative adjustments sometimes appear strange until the full record is visible. Acting on incomplete assumptions could easily make things worse. So I began approaching the information the same way I handled investigations at work. Methodically, the spreadsheet on my screen became the starting point. I reviewed every statement again, this time paying closer attention to the details I had ignored years earlier when I first digitized the files. Routing numbers, account identifiers, transaction descriptions. Each small detail helped clarify where the money had actually traveled. The destination account appeared repeatedly, always receiving funds from the trust in irregular but consistent intervals. The amounts varied. Sometimes they were small enough to pass unnoticed inside a long bank statement. Other times they were large enough to make the monthly balance drop sharply. What mattered most was the accumulation. Over time, those withdrawals created the total I had already calculated, a number that kept returning no matter how many times I double-checked the math. $360,000. I saved the spreadsheet under a new file name and started looking for information that could confirm whether the account receiving the transfers belonged to someone inside the family. Public financial records rarely reveal everything, but certain details can still appear if you know where to look. After several hours of searching, I located the first connection. The destination account was linked to a financial services profile registered under my father's name. It wasn't part of any investment portfolio connected to my uncle's trust. Instead, it appeared as a separate personal account, one that had never been mentioned when the trust arrangement was first explained to the family. That discovery shifted my concern into something more concrete. Still, I needed confirmation that the trust itself had not authorized those movements. The simplest way to check that was to verify where my uncle was actually living and how his care was being funded. For years, my parents had described his situation in reassuring terms. According to them, he was staying in a comfortable private care facility outside the city, somewhere quiet where medical supervision was available if he needed it. The description sounded expensive, which made sense given the size of the trust that had been created for him, but the documents on my screen suggested the trust balance had been shrinking steadily. The numbers didn't match the story. Rather than confronting anyone directly, I decided to confirm the information independently. A licensed investigator recommended by a colleague agreed to perform a basic verification. The request was simple: confirm my uncle's current residence and gather publicly accessible details about the facility providing his care. The report arrived several days later. The investigator's findings were straightforward and written in neutral language. My uncle was indeed living in a care facility, but it was not the private residence my parents had described. The building listed in the report was a state-supported senior housing complex on the outskirts of the county. Clean, functional, affordable. The monthly cost listed in the documentation was far lower than the figures my father had mentioned whenever the subject came up during family conversations. The difference between those two numbers immediately stood out. If the trust had been paying for a high-end private facility, the withdrawals might have made sense. But that wasn't where my uncle was living. I sat with the report for a long time after reading it. The townhouse dispute now looked less like an isolated conflict and more like a distraction that had appeared at exactly the moment I started examining the trust records. The timing felt too convenient to ignore. My parents had pushed aggressively for control over half of my property, even to the point of hiring a lawyer to threaten legal action. At the same time, large amounts of money had quietly disappeared from an account they managed for someone else. I began organizing the information into a single file: the spreadsheet showing the transfers, the investigator's report confirming my uncle's residence, copies of the original trust statements from years earlier. Each document added another layer to the picture forming on my laptop screen. When placed together, the records didn't tell an emotional story about family disagreements or misunderstandings. They described a sequence of financial decisions. By the time I finished compiling everything, the file looked less like personal notes and more like an audit summary, waiting to be reviewed by someone with authority. I closed the laptop and sat there in silence for a while, considering what the next step should be. My parents were still expecting me to respond to the lawyer's demand about the townhouse. From their perspective, the situation remained simple: sign the document, add Felicia's name to the property, and the conflict disappears. But the information now sitting on my computer had changed the balance of the conversation completely. The mediation meeting they requested would not be about my townhouse anymore. The mediation meeting took place in a quiet office building not far from downtown Pittsburgh. The room itself looked exactly like the kind of place designed to keep emotions under control. Neutral walls, a long wooden table, several identical chairs arranged carefully around it. Nothing in the space encouraged confrontation, yet the tension inside the room felt unmistakable the moment I walked in. Daniel Whitmore, the mediator, greeted everyone with the practiced calm of someone who spent most of his career watching families argue over property and expectations. His role was simple: keep the discussion structured, guide both sides toward a settlement, and prevent the conversation from turning into a shouting match. From his perspective, the situation probably looked routine. A dispute over real estate between relatives. My parents were already seated when I arrived. My mother sat with her hands folded in front of her, her posture stiff but controlled. Felicia was beside her, scrolling through her phone with the restless energy she always carried into uncomfortable situations. My father sat at the end of the table. Ronald Carter looked completely composed, as if this meeting were just another financial appointment in a long day of professional conversations. A thin folder rested in front of him. When he noticed me take a seat across from him, he gave a small nod that felt more like acknowledgement than greeting. The mediator began by outlining the process. Both sides would present their positions. If possible, a compromise would be discussed. If no agreement could be reached, the matter would move forward through the legal system. His explanation was calm and methodical, but underneath the procedural language, I could feel the quiet assumption that some kind of middle ground would eventually appear. My father spoke first. He described the situation in the same measured tone he had used during our previous conversations. According to him, the conflict existed because one daughter had obtained property while the other had none. Families, he explained, sometimes need to correct those kinds of imbalances in order to remain stable. The mediator listened carefully while taking notes. My father continued outlining what he called the reasonable solution. Shared ownership of the townhouse would allow both daughters to benefit from the asset while avoiding a lengthy legal dispute. The proposal, in his words, created fairness without causing financial harm to anyone involved. While he spoke, my mother nodded quietly. Felicia watched the table. When he finished, the mediator turned his attention to me and asked for my response. His expression remained neutral, but the expectation was clear. This was the moment when most disputes moved toward negotiation. Instead, I placed my laptop on the table. The movement immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. My father's eyes followed the device as I opened it, his expression tightening slightly for the first time since the meeting began. I rotated the screen so everyone could see it. The spreadsheet filled the display. Rows of numbers, transaction dates, and transfer amounts stretched down the page in a sequence that took weeks to reconstruct. At the bottom of the document, the final total remained visible: $360,000. For several seconds, no one spoke. The mediator leaned forward slightly, trying to understand what he was looking at. My mother's posture shifted as her attention moved from my father to the screen. Felicia stopped scrolling through her phone. The calm structure of the meeting had quietly collapsed. I began explaining the records in the same analytical tone I used during compliance reviews at work. The spreadsheet documented transfers from the trust account established for my uncle's care. Each line represented money that left that account and entered another one connected to my father's financial profile. I described the timeline, the pattern, the accumulation of withdrawals that eventually produced the total, displayed at the bottom of the page. The mediator's pen stopped moving. Across the table, my father's composure faded in small, visible stages. First, the tightening around his eyes, then the slight shift in his posture as he leaned closer to examine the screen. For the first time since the meeting began, he looked uncertain about where the conversation was going. My mother asked a quiet question about the numbers. I answered by opening another document. The investigator's report appeared next. It confirmed the location of my uncle's residence and listed the monthly cost of the facility where he currently lived. The amount shown in the report was dramatically lower than the figures my father had referenced whenever the subject came up during family conversations. The difference between those two numbers hung in the air. The mediator slowly sat back in his chair. What began as a discussion about shared property had transformed into something else entirely. The documents on my screen were no longer related to the townhouse dispute. They described a completely different financial issue, one that none of the participants had expected to confront during mediation. My father closed the folder in front of him. For the first time that afternoon, Ronald Carter looked directly at me without the confidence he had carried into the room. The consequences started quietly. For several days after the mediation meeting, no one from my family contacted me. The silence felt strange at first, but I understood what it meant. The conversation in that room had moved beyond family pressure or emotional arguments. Once financial records were placed in front of a neutral mediator, the situation stopped being something that could be ignored. The next step was no longer personal. It was procedural. I organized the documents the same way I would prepare any compliance report at work. The spreadsheet showing the transfers, the investigator's verification of my uncle's residence, and copies of the original trust statements were placed into a single file. Each document supported the others. Together, they created a clear sequence of financial decisions that no longer depended on my interpretation. Once everything was assembled, the file was sent to the appropriate oversight office responsible for reviewing financial fiduciaries in our county. After that, the process moved on its own. Investigations like that do not happen overnight, but they follow a predictable structure. Auditors review transaction histories, compare them with authorized trust activity, and verify whether the account manager followed the responsibilities attached to the role. Those responsibilities are strict because the person controlling a trust is expected to act entirely in the interest of the beneficiary. In this case, that beneficiary was my uncle. Weeks passed before the first official notice appeared. My father's financial advisory license was suspended pending review. The investigators had confirmed irregular withdrawals from the trust account and began tracing where those funds had gone. Once subpoenas were issued for the relevant banking records, the pattern I had discovered in my spreadsheet appeared again in the official reports. $360,000 had been redirected over time. The explanation eventually recorded in the investigation described it as unauthorized use of funds assigned to a protected account. That language carried serious consequences under Pennsylvania financial law. The restitution order that followed required the money to be returned to the trust, and my father permanently lost the professional credentials that allowed him to manage financial assets. My parents sold their house not long after the ruling. The proceeds were used to repay the missing funds and settle the legal costs that came with the investigation. Felicia moved out of her apartment within the same period, the financial support she had relied on for years disappearing almost overnight. I watched those events from a distance. None of them contacted me during that time, and I didn't try to reach them either. The separation felt final in a way that surprised even me. For most of my life, I believed family conflict eventually circled back toward reconciliation. This situation proved that assumption wrong. Some actions break trust beyond repair. Life in my townhouse became quieter after that. The empty room slowly filled with furniture, books, and the ordinary routines that come with living alone. From the back patio, I could see the lights of Pittsburgh spread across the valley in the evenings, a reminder of how far the city stretched beyond the small disputes that once felt overwhelming. Looking back now, the lesson I carry from all of this isn't really about money or property. It's about boundaries. Working hard for something does not create an obligation to surrender it simply because others feel entitled to it. Responsibility toward family matters, but responsibility also includes recognizing when loyalty is being used as leverage. That distinction took me years to understand. If there is anything worth remembering from this story, it is that protecting your integrity sometimes means walking away from people who refuse to respect it. The choice is painful, but ignoring the truth only delays consequences that eventually arrive anyway. Thank you for listening to my story.